Have you ever been outside? There are probably plants all around you, but have you ever noticed how similar they all look? Well, it's because all land plants go through the same basic life cycle. So, in this video, we're going to take a look at what that is. All plants start their lives as something called a sporophyte. A sporophyte is a diploid organism, meaning that it has two sets of chromosomes. One set came from its mother, and one set came from its father. Diploid organisms are often compared to having two copies of a textbook where haploid organisms only have one copy. So with two copies of each chromosome, the plant has two copies of every gene. Now the job of the sporophyte is to undergo meiosis, which is a type of cell division that reduces the number of copies of each chromosome by half. So if the sporophyte has two copies of every chromosome, the daughter cells produced from meiosis will only have one copy of every chromosome. These daughter cells are haploid and are known as spores. So now we have our first multicellular diploid organism, the sporophyte, and our second multicellular haploid organism, the gametophyte. So just like animals, plants alternate between being diploid and haploid. But unlike animals, plants don't do it in the way you might expect. If you remember back to the very beginning of this video, I said that the sporophyte produces spores via meiosis, and then I said that these spores are haploid. But aren't spores technically cells? Well, yes. Are they multicellular? Well, no. So that means that at some point after the formation of the spores, they need to multiply via mitosis so that they can grow into a multicellular organism. This means that the haploid phase of the plant alternates between being unicellular and multicellular. If you look at most plants, though, the haploid phase is pretty inconspicuous. It usually shows up as a small, insignificant structure attached to the underside of a leaf or as part of the flower. But there are a few plants whose gametophytes are actually quite prominent. For example, the gametophytes of mosses are the main structure that we associate with the plant. The leafy green stuff that we see is actually the diploid sporophyte growing out of a small structure on top of the moss called the capsule. On the other hand, vascular plants, such as trees and flowers, tend to have very inconspicuous gametes. In fact, for many years, scientists didn't even know what they looked like. In flowering plants, the male gametophyte is produced in the anthers of the flower and consists of two cells, a body cell and a generative cell. The generative cell divides to produce two sperm cells. That's it. The entire male gametophyte consists of just 3 cells, one of which actually functions as the sperm. Meanwhile, the female gametophyte consists of many cells and is contained within the ovule of the flower. The female gametophyte is also called the embryo sac. Within the embryo sac is an egg cell and a central cell which contains 2 polar nuclei. So when you think about how large the tree is that produced the flower, the actual gametophyte is extremely small. In conifers, the male gametophyte is even smaller, consisting of just a couple of cells, but the structure that carries them is quite large and easy to spot. Conifer pollen is produced in these male cones and is carried to the female cones by wind or animals. Once the pollen grain lands on the female cone, it germinates and grows a pollen tube down into the ovule. At the base of the pollen tube is the pollen cell, and above it sits the generative cell. The pollen cell provides nutrition to the growing pollen tube, and the generative cell divides to form 2 sperm cells. The pollen tube eventually grows all the way to the egg cell, and one of the sperm cells fertilizes the egg while the other sperm cell fuses with the 2 polar nuclei in the central cell. This fertilization event results in a triploid cell, meaning it has 3 sets of chromosomes. The triploid zygote begins to divide and develop into the next sporophyte, which will eventually grow out of the seed. Meanwhile, the fertilized central cell develops into the nutritive tissue surrounding the seed called endosperm. Now, let's take a look at what happens in mosses since they are non-vascular plants. Moss spores germinate and grow into a structure called a protonemata. which is essentially a filament of cells that grows towards light. Eventually, the protonemata stops growing, and instead of producing leaves and stems, it produces buds. These buds grow into the leafy gametophytes that we recognize as mosses. If you remember, the gametophyte is the haploid phase of the life cycle, and what we're describing here is its growth from a single cell into a multicellular organism. So this means that the haploid phase of the moss life cycle alternates between being multicellular and unicellular. You may have noticed that we keep referring to the structures produced by the sporophyte as spores, and the structures produced by the gametophyte as gametes. However, the term gametes more specifically refers to the sex cells, sperm, and egg. So technically, we should refer to these structures as sporangia and gametangia. We'll use the terms interchangeably throughout the rest of the video. Let's go back to the moss sporophyte growing out of the capsule. The sporophyte consists of a foot, a stalk, and a capsule. The foot anchors the sporophyte to the gametophyte and receives nutrition from it. The stalk, also called the seta, supports the capsule, and when it elongates, it pulls the capsule up with it. As the sporophyte matures, it produces haploid spores within the capsule. When the spores are mature, they are released from the capsule and dispersed by wind or animals. When conditions are right, they germinate and begin growing towards light until they reach a bud, which eventually grows into the leafy green gametophyte that we associate with mosses. Bryophytes, like mosses, are non-vascular plants, meaning that they lack specialized tissues for conducting water and nutrients. They are therefore small plants that require moist environments. On the other hand, vascular plants are plants with specialized tissues for conducting water and nutrients, allowing them to grow taller and live in drier environments. Vascular plants also have specialized structures for reproduction. We already talked about how in flowering plants the male gametophyte consists of just a couple of cells, but the structure that carries them, the pollen grain, is quite large. In conifers, the male gametophyte is even smaller, consisting of just a couple of cells, but the structure that carries them is quite large and easy to spot. Conifer pollen is produced in these male cones and is carried to the female cones by wind or animals. Once the pollen grain lands on the female cone, it germinates and grows a pollen tube down into the ovule. At the base of the pollen tube is the pollen cell, and above it sits the generative cell. The pollen cell provides nutrition to the growing pollen tube, and the generative cell divides to form two sperm cells. The pollen tube eventually grows all the way to the egg cell, and one of the sperm cells fertilizes the egg while the other sperm cell fuses with the two polar nuclei in the central cell. This fertilization event results in a triploid cell, meaning it has 3 sets of chromosomes. The triploid zygote begins to divide and develop into the next sporophyte, which will eventually grow out of the seed. Meanwhile, the fertilized central cell develops into the nutritive tissue surrounding the seed called endosperm. As you can see, the sporophyte and gametophyte phases of vascular plants are much more dependent on each other than they are in bryophytes. Finally, we come to algae, which are mostly aquatic organisms. Like plants, algae undergo alternation of generations, alternating between being diploid and haploid. However, their life cycles are more complex than those of land plants and vary greatly depending on the group of algae. For example, some algae are isomorphic, meaning the haploid and diploid forms are structurally identical. Other algae are anisomorphic, meaning the haploid and diploid forms look different from one another. Still others are heteromorphic, meaning the haploid and diploid phases are very different and can even have different ploidy levels. No matter what type of algae you look at, though, they all share one thing in common: a multicellular haploid phase. Unlike land plants, algae never have a multicellular diploid phase. So, unlike land plants, the haploid phase of their life cycle is always the dominant phase. I hope this video helped you understand how plants alternate between being diploid and haploid, and if you want even more details, check out the references.